Welcome to the Estates Made Simple podcast. My name is Jenna Carvello of Guardian Estate Company, and I'm here with my co-host Gordon Vanderleek of Vanderleek Law. Gordon, nice to talk to you as always. I love what we're going to talk about today, but before we do that, I'll let you give a little bit of a disclaimer here.
Yeah, we like to start the podcast, I guess, just to set the stage to say that the information we're discussing is of general information. It's hard for us to know, or nor can we give specific advice regarding your particular situation. So what we're talking about is information, not advice. And if the topics we're talking about here or estate administration questions do come up, we would love to sit down and have a tea or coffee with you and see how we can help you, and then provide a proper start to a relationship for which we then are giving advice, but with the acknowledgement that anything we say here isn't to be taken as a legal or other advice regarding your estate situation. We look forward to talking about what do I do with pets, right? It's interesting when we think about this topic, the animal members of our family are as much of part of the family as anything, right? That they're an important consideration of, in dealing with estates. And I think a unique topic. So thank you. I'll give credit for you selecting the topic, Jenna, and maybe even from your experience having been a trust officer, I think you've written a blog on this as well. Why don't you take us into what are some of the considerations for dealing with pets as part of estate administration?
Well, thank you. I often think of the pets that I had growing up and
Mhm.
what would happen to them if I passed away. And so it does pull at your heartstrings a little bit. It's something that's very close to your heart. But, executors often don't think about all of their duties that they will have to do when somebody passes away, one of which is ensuring that anyone that deceased cared for has proper care and shelter and food. That could include children, but it also can include pets. Because if the deceased lived alone with pets, ensuring that those pets are cared for is one of the most immediate tasks that the executor will need to do. Because as you mentioned before the call here, Gord, if you don't tend to it right away, the pets are gone. They could
Yeah.
die. So, getting into the home, ensuring that the pets are cared for immediately is often one of the most first steps that an executor will need to take. And it's an important step, of course, as you know.
Yeah. And I think there's a time sensitivity to it, and as an executor, if it's part of your responsibility, you're ultimately accountable to, like, did you make the appropriate decision, right? It makes me think too that if you're being asked to be an executor, it's a pretty relevant consideration to say, well, what do you want me to do with the pets? If you know the person has pets, right? And just ensuring they may have some instructions, or at least there's a conversation about, well, who would you like me to call for something like this, right? I mean, some of those real practical considerations, like, where's the vet? I think sometimes what comes up is, what about the financial provision for this animal on an ongoing basis? But yeah, there's that immediacy of making sure you're preserving and protecting and making good decisions for the welfare of that animal. And in some cases, the bigger the animal, the bigger the issue or the problem, right? Now you get into, and we've, certainly as part of my practice, you come across people who have equestrian interests. Well, that's a serious issue, right? Because now there's this horse that needs food and
Right.
can be expensive, right? Like,
Yeah.
who's going to pay for that? What are decisions being made, and how do you ensure the proper care? So there's a number of planning considerations, that if that's part of your family, then you could introduce or integrate pets into the planning consideration. And I guess that's a segue to the point of saying, ultimately, the first thing you're gonna do is look at the will, right? I mean,
Hmm.
beyond the immediacy of making sure they're fed and they're safe, and you're dealing with that, is that you want to consider, is there any financial provision, right? And in some cases, it's not often, but it does happen that people will create an animal trust. I find historically the scenarios where I've done those trusts have been typically for the larger animals, those with equestrian interests, and they've got a number of different horses. And it's like, well, you're not going to just saddle that that financial burden on somebody,
Right.
whether it's maybe your kids or a sibling or a parent. In that situation, you would say, well, how are they going to be cared for? Because the vets are not going to do it for free, and they need food every day, and they need shelter, and that costs a certain amount. So what's the plan? And at the end of the day, you want to make sure that the lack of financial provision doesn't end up leading to a poor decision about the ongoing welfare for that animal, right? So beyond the immediacy of just keeping the animal safe, then it's like, well, what do we do with this animal? And I think for the most part, the clients that I deal with go, we want to make sure the animal's not put down, just because there's uncertainty about how to provide for the animal. So I think it's a real consideration to say, what does that look like? And I think ultimately, as an executor, if you're spending money out of the estate to care for the animal, I mean, ultimately you're accountable for, well, why did this money get taken out? Why were you spending this money? Is that
Mhm.
something you should have been doing as the executor? So I think there's also certainly a lot of work involved in organizing a communication strategy for the beneficiaries and or family members, like who's going to take the animal becomes an important consideration, right? Oftentimes the animals are especially for couples who don't have their own children, they may have their fur children. Their animals are their children. And as you said from the outset, provision and a plan for them becomes highly relevant. Who's going to be the guardian? We name
Mhm.
guardians for our minor children, right? But it's like, who's going to be the guardian for one's pets? And oftentimes we find those things making their way into a letter of instruction, so there's a plan in place that can be implemented on there. So certainly it affects the beneficiaries. You have to connect with them and the extended family to see, is there somebody who's willing to step up, and what does that look like? Or otherwise to find a suitable home, for the pet, to make sure that they are cared for, particularly if you acknowledge and understand that that is the deceased person's wish, right? Presumably, if they have a pet, they love and care for that pet and they don't want to see it put down because of their untimely demise. They would want that pet to live out their years, in a proper setting. And so it is, I think, highly relevant to give some consideration to what does that look like in your situation. Obviously, it's
Mhm.
different if you go, I have a cat versus I have 6 horses. That's a different conversation, but I think the conversation should be had. I think what's interesting too is what I've seen is more so on the planning side, I suppose, is that there may be a difference of opinion between the couple.
Right.
If you pose the question to the animal lover portion of the couple and the other person is not so much an animal lover, there may be a different plan. So just getting in sync and having a conversation, coming to an agreement of, well, no, this is what needs to happen, would be an important consideration, right? And it's a good topic to think about. And what are the instructions you're leaving your executors so there's not that stress? Because as you said from the outset, it can be a huge amount of stress in terms of what is the plan with regard to that.
Yeah, and you mentioned a trust for pets. Researching for this podcast, I looked up the wealthiest pet in the world, and one of the top options was a cat that was worth $13 million. And their owner had passed away and left their entire inheritance in trust for this cat. So you definitely don't need to leave that much to a pet. Maybe 5,000 or a couple thousand cover food and medical. But I thought that was a
That's an
pretty funny
interesting
story.
stat. Yeah.
And working as a trust officer in my previous role, we often had to deal with animals. And one estate that we worked with, this gentleman had passed away way too early, leaving 2 dogs that he cherished and cared for. And there was no instructions in the will, no family that was willing to take the animals. And it ended up being his investment advisor that agreed to take them.
Oh my
Just given
goodness.
the long relationship they had. And so you have to be creative and look to different avenues. But I'm sure that that individual appreciated that their dogs were cared for by someone who
Yeah.
knew them. So yeah, I love that story. Just because it shows how integrated professionals can get in their clients' lives.
Yeah, exactly. Although it's interesting to be a fly on the wall when investment advisor comes home and says, honey, guess what?
Yeah.
Here's what's happened. What do we do with that situation, right? But yeah, to the extent, especially for investment advisors, probably seeing clients a lot more regularly, for example, than lawyers, where you might see somebody every 3 to 5 years to update their will. They're probably meeting, talking monthly or quarterly, reviewing their finances in a long-term relationship. Then you get invested and connected to the family, right? In
Yeah.
terms of that becomes highly relevant for sure.
Yeah. So I think, it's an important topic, and appreciate that all of our listeners are listening. Obviously, it would be near and dear to their heart as well. So thank you everyone for listening. Please subscribe to future podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.